if the Senate had remained a majority rule institution, slavery was going to be abolished faster, and then later Jim Crow was going to be ended faster.
Hello, I'm Guido Girgenti.
And I'm Waleed Shahid.
And you're listening to Bloc Party, a show about the fight for the soul of the Democratic Party, with bloc versus bloc congressional negotiations, and movements bringing demands to the negotiating table. Today, Waleed Shahid takes the hosting mic.
They've been waiting for this moment for weeks.
And he sits down for his first one-on-one interview at the Bloc Party. Waleed Shahid, Communications Director for the Justice Democrats. How are you feeling after that interview?
I just feel really angry. When you hear the interview, you're like, what the f***? Why? Why?
Well, that's why you'll be returning for the outro, so that when the audience is stunned, asking why?
It's quite stunning. The interview is quite stunning.
But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Waleed, tell everyone who you interviewed this week.
I spoke to Adam Jentleson, a former Deputy Chief of Staff to Majority Leader Harry Reid, and a guy who wrote a book with really good timing about how we've all been lied to for years, several years.
He knew.
People should check out Adam's book, Kill Switch, The Rise of the Modern Senate and the Crippling of American Democracy. I've been wanting to have this conversation for at least 5 years. One thing we start the conversation with is Sandy Hook. December 2012, horrible mass shooting happens at an elementary school in Newtown, Connecticut. And the legislative remedy to this horrible mass shooting is the Manchin-Toomey gun reform bill. Two moderates, Joe Manchin, the most conservative Democrat, Pat Toomey, the most liberal Republican, they put forward a super common sense, super popular, super urgent bill.
Americans on both sides of the debate can and must find common ground. That's what Pat and I have been working on and what we've been able to do. Today's agreement is a first step in a common ground that all of us agree is crucial to keep guns out of dangerous hands and to keep our children safe. This is a bipartisan movement. It's a bipartisan amendment, and we all know that a bipartisan solution is a lasting solution. But nobody here in good conscience could sit by and not try to prevent a day that has happened at Newtown from ever happening again.
People thought it would just go through the Senate because it had over 80% support in public opinion.
And it's less than 2 months after Obama has beaten Romney. Democrats have won a Senate majority again. And it's like the dream of bipartisanship. Manchin from West Virginia, the guy who shot the climate bill with his shotgun.
I sued EPA, and I'll take dead aim at the cap and trade bill.
He's like, I've come together across the aisle with a gun reform bill. Let's do it.
Yeah, and Democrats really have a mandate after the 2012 elections. They've just taken the majority in the Senate again. And Adam tells the story about what it was like to be in the room when the filibuster was deployed by Republicans to destroy the hopes of parents of the children who were killed at Sandy Hook. It's really a horrible story, but a telling story about the way the filibuster has been deployed in the modern era.
A few minutes ago, a minority in the United States Senate decided it wasn't worth it. They blocked common sense gun reforms, even while these families looked on from the Senate gallery. By now, it's well known that 90% of the American people support universal background checks that make it harder for a dangerous person to buy a gun. Most Americans think that's already the law. And a few minutes ago, 90% of Democrats in the Senate voted for that idea. But it's not going to happen, because 90% of Republicans in the Senate just voted against that idea. A majority of senators voted yes to protecting more of our citizens with smarter background checks. But by this continuing distortion of Senate rules, a minority was able to block it from moving forward.
I will be honest, that sequence of events in spring 2013 was so depressing as it happened. I don't think I actually internalized that it really was the filibuster. I think I would think back and be like, that bill was killed by the filibuster, right? And I was like, nah, that seems just so horrible and unreal.
You forget that Democrats had the majority when that happened.
I do. That's right. It's like you forget when Democrats had a Senate majority because it doesn't matter. You only think back to, quote unquote, times where Democrats had a congressional majority when they had 60 votes. Man, that's a trip. But going back to the good timing of this book, there's a debate unfurling in real time as we're recording this last week of January 2021 about what Democrats should do to overcome GOP obstruction, given that Vice President Kamala Harris can provide a tie-breaking vote in the Senate. By the rules of the Senate, they have the majority, but they know they're going to get filibustered.
So we talk about the use of reconciliation. We're going to get more into what that means. Senator Bernie Sanders has been talking a lot about it over the past few weeks. He's offered that as a remedy to the filibuster quandary. Adam expands on what Bernie means by reconciliation and how reconciliation might not be the cure-all that some people think it is.
It's funny because it does become a debate almost about which parliamentary procedure you focus on to overcome the parliamentary bullshit of the GOP using the filibuster to kill everything. And I think the left is united on figuring that out, but not necessarily united on should you nuke the filibuster or should you try to get as much done through what's called budgetary reconciliation. As you reshuffle the spending for the year, you can change things in the budget. It's an intra-party debate about how to do anything with one slim majority.
And the even bigger picture is that the entire fate of the Biden agenda and perhaps the modern Democratic Party as we know it relies on figuring out this quandary. If Democrats aren't able to deliver before the 2022 midterms, they could lose unified control of the federal government for a decade, for a generation. The whole math of the way the House of Representatives and the Senate is set up is tilted toward Republicans. And so the most fundamental question in our democracy over the next 6 months is whether Democrats will fight for a government that represents and delivers for the majority of people who elected them, or whether we're going to allow Republicans to enshrine minority rule and obstruct the ability of Democrats to get things done.
And given the experience with something like the Manchin-Toomey gun reform bill, there's such a swell of public outcry, rage, and popular momentum that moves a bipartisan bill forward to have that killed by the filibuster.
Guido, I was just looking this up. In New Zealand, they had the deadliest mass shooting ever in their country. And less than 1 month after that shooting, they banned semi-automatic weapons. In our country, it's been 8 years since Sandy Hook and so many other mass shootings. Millions of students across the country walked out after the Parkland shooting. And we have yet to deliver a single gun reform bill from our Congress.
The other bit of good timing, I think, for Adam is that more and more and more liberals are coming to terms with the threat of entrenched minority rule by a reactionary white nationalist Republican Party.
I think there is an interesting overlap of people on the left and just normie Democrats who want to govern for normie Democrats. And that's why I just wanted to end with a recent interview with the most normiest Democrat in the country, President Obama, talking about this dynamic. He's very clear-eyed about how ridiculous and toxic the filibuster is to Democratic Party governance and the fate of our multiracial democracy. Here's President Obama.
Let's take a simple example like the Senate. So Wyoming, which has about 500,000 people, has the same number of senators as California with 33 million people. What that means is that the U.S. Senate basically is hugely skewed towards some of these lower population, more rural, much whiter states than the big coastal states. This is the stuff that we've got to know if we really want to change stuff. You have to know about the filibuster in the Senate. So this is a rule that wasn't even in the Constitution that says you have to have 60 votes to pass legislation. You have to have a supermajority. And that's what happened to me in my first 2 years, was I was having to get to 60 votes on everything, which meant that the number of senators that were basically representing 25% of the country had a veto power over anything we wanted to try to get done. But most people don't know that.
Welcome back. My name is Waleed Shahid. I'm joined by Adam Jentleson, formerly the Deputy Chief of Staff to Senate Democratic leader Harry Reid and author of a new book, Kill Switch: The Rise of the Modern Senate and the Crippling of American Democracy. Adam, welcome to Bloc Party. How are you doing?
Thanks for having me. I'm great. It's great to be here.
Adam, your book title is a metaphor. The Senate is a kill switch that can be turned on, so to speak, to kill legislation. But the metaphor isn't the first thing that comes to mind when you think of the Senate. You write in your first chapter, "When I think about the Senate, I see a broken man." Who is this broken man?
So that's Neil Heslin. He was a father of a first grader who was murdered in Newtown, Connecticut, in the massacre there in December of 2012. Neil is a Republican. He's a conservative. I met him because under those tragic circumstances, he came to Washington. He was advocating for universal background checks, and many gun control advocates would tell you that's just about the least that we can do. You know, Neil and his fellow Newtown parents and the senators they worked with did everything right in terms of how the legislative process is supposed to work. The idea of universal background checks was supported by a bipartisan group of senators. They got 55 senators in support of it. It was supported by gun groups across the ideological spectrum, not just liberal gun control groups, but also groups in favor of Second Amendment rights. It was supported by 90% of the American public, polls showed at the time. And despite all of this, it was killed by a filibuster, but not by the Jimmy Stewart-style talking filibuster. There was very little actual debate during the course of the Senate's consideration of this legislation. The senators who opposed this bill and were supposedly using the filibuster to block it spoke for a grand total of a couple of hours over the course of a week. Mitch McConnell, who was leading the opposition, spoke for about 2 minutes in total. He took more time during this week to celebrate the legacy of Margaret Thatcher and the victory of the Louisville men's basketball team in the March Madness tournament that year.
Were you in the room with Neil when this happened?
Yeah, so I was in the room with Neil.
I just imagine you're like an idealistic young staffer in the Obama presidency who just got swept into this transformative vision of hope and change. And then there's like a man there who deserves more than anything hope and change, and you're unable to deliver it.
I tell you, man, it was the most heartbreaking moment of my time in the Senate, and I think I'm still not over it. It was shortly after the vote had failed, and so it was an unscheduled meeting. The majority leader's office is right off of the Senate floor, just a few steps away. You know, Neil had met with Senator Reid. It was the two of them, me, and a few other staffers. I don't remember exactly what was said because not much was said. I remember Neil is this big guy, sort of built like a linebacker. I don't know if he was actually crying, but it sure seemed like he was holding back tears. And, you know, here's a guy who's headed back to Newtown empty-handed. His government had rejected his appeals. It was April by the time the bill failed. So Neil was going to leave Washington, go back to Newtown, and he still had the Christmas tree that he and his son Jesse were about to decorate standing in his living room. And it was profoundly, profoundly depressing.
I wanted to back up a little bit because a lot of people have worked in Democratic Senate leadership. A lot of them leave Capitol Hill, work in the private sector, be a lobbyist on K Street. But as I was reading your book, I kept stopping because I recognized so many of your colleagues' names in the Senate leadership at the time. All these Harry Reid staffers who went on to have careers in the progressive movement. Kristen Orthman became Elizabeth Warren's spokesperson during her presidential campaign. Faz Shakir became Bernie Sanders' campaign manager. Brian Fallon appears in your book as a top Schumer aide who went on to found Demand Justice to push Democrats on reforming the Supreme Court. And Rebecca Katz founded New Deal Strategies and was a senior strategist for Jamal Bowman's primary campaign for Congress. What did Harry Reid do to all of you to make you so angry at the Democratic Party establishment that you guys find yourself on the left and no longer in the parts of the Democratic Party establishment you used to be?
It's a really good question. I mean, you know, and it's especially funny if you think of who Reid was when he started this. I mean, when I went to work for him in 2010, I was like, oh, great. It was a good job. It was a job in leadership. But Reid, personally, I didn't think we would get along, and I didn't think that I would align with him ideologically because back then he was still very much a pro-life, pro-gun, moderate Democrat. But there's just something about him. He just has this fighting spirit. 2010 was sort of radicalizing for him in its own way, that he ran for re-election. He was expected to lose. Everybody told him to run to the center on immigration, which was a big issue. Instead, he ran to the left, embraced immigration, and spurred massive turnout and won by 5 points. It wasn't even particularly close. That too, I mean, he had a defiant streak. He didn't like to listen to his consultants. He didn't like to listen to his press staff, as I was and Rebecca was, who tried to tell him to say things that were not crazy sometimes. He's an iconoclast. I mean, he's a rebel. It's kind of a funny thing to say about a guy who's sort of rose to the top of the establishment, but he's just got this fighting spirit. He literally, well, not literally, but almost literally came from a hole in the ground in the desert. The town of Searchlight, where he was born, is literally many miles from anything other than mineral mines. He grew up in a house made out of railroad ties. I'm not kidding. He had to walk many, many miles to get to school. You know, this is a guy who never considered himself part of the establishment. He was always a rebel.
It's like a Grapes of Wrath John Steinbeck character.
I mean, he really was. I mean, you know, even coming up in Nevada politics, you know, he made his bones in Nevada as gaming commissioner in the 70s and 80s when he was pushing the mob out of Vegas. The other thing I would say is that he seeks folks like us out. Well, one of the things that was unique about him is, as leader, he valued having progressive voices in the room. He sought them out and wanted to have those kind of people around him.
Do you remember what Reid said to you and the staff when gun reform failed in 2013?
He didn't say anything. It was over. He's not a sentimental guy. I think he considered it a personal failure, and I think he just was ready to move on. I mean, at the time, we thought that we had a good shot at bringing the bill back up. Our whole political system was kind of in flux. Obama had just won re-election a few months prior. It still sort of seemed like the Tea Party fever might break and that public pressure on Republicans for blocking this bill would build and we'd be able to bring the bill back up and break their filibuster and make them accept it. So it wasn't totally clear at the time that this was the death knell for gun control for the foreseeable future. But there was no big dramatic moment, which was part of what made it so depressing. It was just, this is how the Senate works now, and it's abysmal, but that's what it is.
So you've told us how you went from being a Reid staffer to what I might call a progressive crusader now. Let's get into why you've chosen this fight, and let's make sure we're all on the same page. Explain to us the modern use of the filibuster. Procedurally, what exactly happens when someone uses the filibuster today? What does that mean?
It's a very weird process. What's important for folks to understand is that the 60-vote threshold that we've come to accept as normal is not the vote to pass a bill. It's a procedural vote that comes before the vote to pass a bill, but it's higher than the threshold to pass the bill. The vote to pass a bill in a Senate is, to this day, a simple majority. So in today's Senate of 100 senators, that would be 50. 50 if you have a tiebreaker, 51 if you don't. The step to end debate on a bill is what requires you to get 60. So with every bill that comes to the floor in the Senate, once you bring it to the floor, you have a vote to open debate. It's called a motion to proceed. That is also at 60. So literally, to open debate on a bill and to end debate on a bill both take 60 votes. And if you can do neither of those things, the bill fails. If you can't get 60 to open debate, and then once you're on the debate, if you can't get 60 to end the debate, the bill's dead.
So it's not the Mr. Smith goes to Washington. Someone is literally standing there until they can no longer breathe.
And that is what's so messed up about it, is that it doesn't matter if there's no debate occurring. There doesn't have to actually be any debate taking place. The gun control bill is a great example. Nobody was talking on the floor. When we brought up that 60-vote threshold to end debate, there was no debate to be ended. They had already decided they didn't want to talk anymore. There's nothing more for them to say. They didn't want to defend their position. But it has become this abstraction that is divorced from any idea of actual debate. It's just a procedural tool. And this is how it came to be, because over the course of several decades, obstructionists realized that they had this higher threshold before you got to the final vote. And if they could normalize the idea that that threshold should be the defining verdict on a bill, they could raise how many votes it took to pass a bill. That threshold has to be activated. And that activation of that threshold is what we now call a filibuster. Activating that threshold, again, doesn't require any debate. All you have to do is send an email or make a phone call or have a hallway conversation with someone in Senate Democratic leadership to let them know that you plan to, quote unquote, filibuster this bill. I'm repeating myself here because it's so bizarre. If you're an individual senator and you threaten to filibuster a bill, that threshold goes up as if you were on the floor debating the bill, but you don't actually have to go to the floor to debate the bill.
Right. So it's really armchair activism, what you're describing.
It's totally armchair activism. That's exactly right.
As I was reading your book, I see that you are watching Mitch McConnell kill bills and presidential appointments with the filibuster and the Obama era, and it's the precise moment when liberals are celebrating Obama as a victory and an overcoming of the nation's history of white supremacy. And then the more I read your book and understand the history of the filibuster, the more I found myself shouting, why did we treat the filibuster like some hallowed part of the world's greatest deliberative body? Can you lay out the relationship between the specific Senate procedure, the filibuster, and its actual use in the 19th and 20th century to protect slavery and Jim Crow?
Without having a rose-colored view of American history, I think the basic thing to keep in mind is that the steady march of progress eliminating first slavery and then Jim Crow, it obviously took far too long, but that was the direction things were headed. And so if the Senate had remained a majority rule institution, slavery was going to be abolished faster, and then later Jim Crow was going to be ended faster. And so what happened was Southern senators had a very powerful need to increase the power of their numerical minority that they represented in the Senate to block the progress that the majority wanted to see. And I want to be clear that there were other filibusters, there were other uses of it, but it didn't have a name. It was extremely rare. It was not operating on any systemic basis. When I say rare, I'm talking about around a dozen over the course of like 30 or 40 years. It was unusual. Obstruction wasn't a thing that happened frequently in the Senate. John Calhoun is the spiritual grandfather of the Confederacy. He was a senator from South Carolina and the chief advocate of and defender of slavery in the Senate starting around the 1830s and through his death in 1850. He was the father of nullification of the idea that eventually led to the Civil War, that individual states could ignore federal laws, and forged that idea around slavery because he wanted to ignore laws that were leading to the elimination of slavery. He was a horrible, horrible racist. He gave speeches on the Senate floor explaining that not only was slavery not evil, it was a positive good. Those are his words. It was good not just for white people, but also for black people. You know, his driving motivation was that he saw the slave states becoming outnumbered, and so he needed to increase the power of the minority. And that is why he forged what would later become known as this talking filibuster, and he was the chief innovator behind it. In the Jim Crow era, it was a similar dynamic where America was ready to implement at least some rudimentary civil rights laws long before we actually started passing them in 1957, 1960, 1964. Anti-lynching laws and laws to end poll taxes and even laws to combat workplace discrimination were ready to be passed as early as 1891 in the case of an anti-poll tax law, and definitely starting in the 1920s.
That is an insane point because we just passed the first anti-lynching law with Kamala Harris and Cory Booker like last year or 2 years ago.
Yes.
I remember reading that and being like, public opinion was in favor of anti-lynching laws in the 19th century.
This is where the myth of the Senate comes in, is that we are sort of taught that while it may have been a bad thing that it took so long to pass civil rights bills, that there was some wisdom in this delay and that the Senate was acting as a cooling saucer so that America could come around to the idea it wasn't ready for civil rights before 1964. But that's not true. It was ready to pass at least anti-lynching laws and anti-poll tax laws as early as the 1920s and the 1930s. Gallup started polling anti-lynching laws in 1937, and it found that 72% of the American people supported anti-lynching laws, federal anti-lynching laws. Even in the South, Gallup found a majority in support of federal anti-lynching laws. The reason they were polling this is that these laws were passing the House by wide margins and coming over to the Senate. And they had presidents of both parties ready on the record saying that they would sign these laws if they came to their desk. In the Senate, you also had a majority of senators in support of these laws. So if the majority had been allowed to rule, you would have had anti-lynching laws, anti-poll tax laws, and potentially anti-discrimination laws starting to pass in the 1920s, or even as early as 1891. The 1891 anti-poll tax law was a very real effort that seemed to have majority support. It was scuttled by some creative obstructionist tactics that its opponents pulled. These weren't radicals bringing up these bills. The 1891 anti-poll tax law was a Henry Cabot Lodge sponsored bill. He was backed by Nelson Aldrich, who was a scion of the Rockefeller East Coast establishment. His daughter married a Rockefeller. He was the guy who created the Federal Reserve. I mean, these aren't crazy left-wing radicals. These are creatures of the establishment. These civil rights laws were establishment positions backed by broad public support, and Southern senators had to find a way to increase the power of the minority in order to block them. There's no rule on the books in the Senate providing for a supermajority threshold until 1917. It was introduced in 1917 for the purpose of ending the filibuster, this cloture vote that we've talked about, of saying, all right, this debate's gone on long enough. A supermajority of senators can come together and say, let's wrap it up and move to the final vote. Over the course of several decades, what Southerners did was they repurposed that rule and started to turn that supermajority threshold into the vote that defined passage or failure. Only civil rights bills were stopped by the filibuster over this period. And I'm talking about a dozen bills, civil rights bills, that could have become law starting in 1891 all the way through 1964, saving God knows how many lives and changing the face of this country. I mean, think about what the representation of the South, how that would have looked differently if the massive black populations in a state like Mississippi, which was like 50% African American in the 1920s, if bills to eliminate poll taxes had been passed as early as 1891 and at least a fraction of that population had been able to vote, really would have changed a lot in this country. And it's kind of depressing to think about the cost of failing to pass it. So
it's really tragic, especially when you consider that the rule is accidentally created by Aaron Burr at the founding of the country and then is later found by white supremacists as their fundamental way that they use to block any reform to white supremacy.
It's just the age-old story of getting a loophole on the books and then having someone exploit it. I mean, what you're talking about with Aaron Burr was vice president and as such was president of the Senate in 1806. And he urges the Senate to eliminate this critical rule almost as an offhand part of editing its rule books. No one at the time knew how important it was going to be, but it ended up being tremendously consequential. The Senate originally had a rule that allowed a majority of senators to vote to bring debate to a close. Like we were talking about before, obstruction was so rare at the very beginning that it never used this rule. And so in 1806, the Senate did its third impeachment. Aaron Burr presided over it. They all were very pleased with themselves. They thought they had done a great job navigating this difficult impeachment. In Aaron Burr's day, the vice president actually did preside over the Senate every day it was in session, so they had a close relationship. And so Burr was giving them a series of recommendations to say, hey, in my experience, trying to be the guy who presides and implements your rules every day, here are some things you could do to change it. And one of the recommendations was to get rid of this rule ending debate because no one ever needed to use it. It was beneath the dignity of senators to obstruct. No one ever had to cut off debate. But because they got rid of that rule, allowing people to end debate, that created the loophole that Calhoun was able to exploit. It took several decades for people to even realize this loophole existed. Obstruction was so rare that no one even bothered to try and search for this rule to cut off debate because they didn't need it. It wasn't until 1841 when Calhoun launched a big filibuster against a bank bill that Henry Clay was like, what's happening? This is terrible. He went to go search for the rule. It wasn't there, and he proposed reinstituting this previous question rule.
So much of the thesis of your book is that the people who defend the filibuster frequently use the founding fathers and their design of our democracy as a defense for why the filibuster exists and should be used to preserve minority rights. But when you bring up that Aaron Burr accidentally put this into the rules and then it was later used by people who wanted to preserve slavery, it really breaks down that whole argument. And I'm looking forward to Kill Switch the musical, where this finally can get into the popular consciousness. I think Aaron Burr is widely known in parts of the American public, but not for this stupid mistake.
Listen, if Lin-Manuel Miranda is listening, he's welcome to give me a call anytime. I'd be happy to lend my skills.
Your book is about this centuries-long conspiracy to kill multiracial democracy. But then you're in the comms war room for Harry Reid, and your boss is like, Adam, can you please shut the up about John Calhoun? We just need you to write a one-sentence response to Politico about why the background checks bill failed. Is that what happened?
Well, I didn't know a lot of this stuff when I worked there. You're someone like me. You're sort of a young, inquisitive staffer, and you go around asking people for answers, and nobody has any answers. And I think that's sort of what led me to write the book.
You're like, do we really have to obey the filibuster?
Well, yeah.
Guys?
I mean, you're told. I mean, it is an institution that is so far up its own. It is so enthralled to its own myth that you can't get a clear answer about why things are this way. That the conversation always sort of ends in some muddled version of this reflects the wisdom of the Senate, generations of institutional know-how. When you look at the history, these are politically motivated power plays, and the people who were best at this power play game were white supremacists. They outmaneuvered liberals time and again. It's not that they were smarter necessarily. A big part of this has to do with their longevity in the Senate. A lot of this took place during the period of the Solid South, where a Senate seat as a Democrat in the South, back when Democrats were the segregationists, was like a lifetime appointment. The Democratic Party had a hammerlock on all of the states in the South. If you won your seat as a Democrat, you would never have a primary challenge. So you got to just be there forever. And that longevity is what gets you power in the Senate. It allows you to rise the ranks of the committee system, which was running on seniority at the time, and learn the rules from being there. And so, they were much better than anybody else at outmaneuvering their opponents. They also had this motivating interest. The maintenance of white supremacy was a very strong motivating factor to keep the Southern bloc together. Other regions have issues that are important to them, but it's not the same. Maintenance of white supremacy was their reason for existence. It was their primary mission. And, this isn't me saying it. They said it themselves. And so, that combination of this driving motivation combined with their longevity and ability to hold on to these seats for their entire lives led them to be the better operators within the Senate.
I mean, the thing that's so profound also about your point that you kind of tease out in the book, but I don't know if you directly say it this way, is that as the politics of the white supremacist South become the core politics of the Republican Party, the ability of the forces of white supremacy to use the filibuster actually increase in the 21st century than in the 1960s. Like, the party that is standing against multiracial democracy can block the majority of people in the country actually much more effectively than the southern states could in the 50s or 60s today.
Yeah, and between the 1960s and now, there was sort of this process of transformation and realignment, and we're sort of coming out the other end of that process now. For listeners who don't know, this is the famous quote from LBJ saying when he signed the Civil Rights Bill that he was signing away the South for a generation. The Democratic Party fully becoming the party of civil rights, as they did after 1964, drove predominantly white and predominantly Southern voters into the Republican Party. It took decades for this to happen, but this was the white backlash that Nixon rode to power in 1968, that Reagan rode to power in 1980, and that we see as a very active force in our politics today. The road to this realignment from 1964 to today basically took that 40-year period to fully sift out, but that is why conservatives are now in the GOP and liberals are Democrats. In 1964, when Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Bill, the most conservative senators were still in the Democratic Party. So it took decades for this alignment to happen. But part of the reason that I think some liberals have trouble seeing this clearly is because of that 30-year period of realignment when it was sort of muddled. When segregationist Democrats were becoming Republicans, there was a lot of bipartisanship. Partisanship acted less strongly on senators. And when the filibuster started to come into common use in the way it is today of imposing a 60-vote threshold, it was relatively even. And so for someone like Biden and a lot of some of the older senators, they were formed in that period. And so they think of the filibuster as a more neutral tool that both parties can use to their advantage when it suits them. They think of the period that they were in the Senate as sort of the way it always was, but it actually was an anomalous period because you had two factors existing then in tandem that probably will never exist together, which is common use of the filibuster and low levels of polarization.
You're talking about like the Biden era, 1970s to early 2000s.
Yeah.
People work across the aisle. Things are normal to them.
Right.
But then something unprecedented starts to happen after President Obama.
Right. First of all, you have a situation where, the parties have sorted, and it sounds crazy to say, but all conservatives weren't sorted into the Republican Party until very recently, the last 10 or 20 years. So you've got a threshold condition of having all conservatives and sort of reactionary-minded people sorted into the Republican Party. There's mountains of political science showing that race was a driving factor in driving that sorting. The increasing salience of racial issues, the census report saying we're on track to a majority-minority country, was seen by some researchers as a watershed moment where white people were really freaked out. And then you have Mitch McConnell, who was willing to wield it to an extent never before seen to sort of activate that implementation of minority control by and on behalf of reactionary white conservatives.
So I wanted to turn to today, where Senator Bernie Sanders has been on TV recently saying that we're going to use reconciliation in the same way Republicans did, but instead of passing tax cuts for the rich and billionaires, we're going to use reconciliation to raise the minimum wage and deliver bold legislation. Is it really that easy? Just reconciliation? We can do everything with a simple majority?
I mean, look, I love Senator Sanders. I love the basic attitude that he's taking towards this of saying we're not going to let Republicans stand in the way and we're going to jam it through on a majority rule basis if we have to. I do worry about the reconciliation is being sold as this sort of fast track procedure, and it may not end up being that. I'm not going to sit here and say we shouldn't use it. The alternative would not be letting Republicans block it, but just going hard at filibuster reform. And reconciliation is a once obscure Senate procedure that was created in the 1970s at a time when the Senate decided it had to start passing a budget every year. And so it created this special process to make that relatively easy. Basically, if you meet a set of very restrictive rules, you are allowed to move legislation through this process that avoids the filibuster. The problem is that restriction. Not very many things can meet those restrictive rules. So therefore, the path of reconciliation is closed off to many really important issues, like many solutions to climate change, basically all civil rights, and all democracy reforms. So any kind of Voting Rights Act, DC statehood, none of that stuff can go through reconciliation. All that stuff is still vulnerable to the filibuster and will probably die by the filibuster if we don't reform it.
And that's because reconciliation is only about things related to
the budget.
Right. And so anything that falls outside of that could theoretically be stopped.
Yeah, and very clever staffers can get pretty creative with how you make something seem to be related to the budget. And using that aggressive approach, you can expand it to include a fair number of things. Things like raising the minimum wage, things like Biden's COVID relief package. So you can get creative up to a point. The problem is nobody has ever put a bill of the size that we're sort of currently contemplating through the reconciliation process. Republicans' tax cut was about the same size as Biden's COVID bill in terms of the top line number, but most of that top line came from one policy, which was tax cuts. Biden's COVID relief package, for example, is, a bunch of different policies stitched together to get to 1.9 trillion. When you're stitching that many policies together and putting it through this process, you're leaving yourself vulnerable to running afoul of these very restrictive rules. You are vulnerable to unfavorable rulings from the parliamentarian at any point. The parliamentarian can unilaterally strike entire swaths of your bill if they decide that it doesn't comply with the rules.
And this is not like Republicans or moderate Democrats. This is just the Senate rules.
Yeah. When you're writing the bill, you try to get feedback from the parliamentarian and try to get a sense of how they're going to rule, but they won't tell you how they're going to rule. And so you write the bill and then you basically submit it. It's like submitting a test to a teacher and you just hope you got the answer right. And sometimes even the best minds on a bill this size, they're gonna miss some questions. It's just inevitable. I'm of a mixed mind on it, but I fear that it's a quagmire. And if progressives go down it, we're gonna find ourselves a couple months from now in a big mess. I'm not necessarily sure that there is an alternative. Going hard at the filibuster now would be preferable, but you would need to have a united front to make that push. And it's going to take some work to get folks like Manchin and Sinema and a few others on board.
Is there a way for Manchin and Sinema to say they didn't eliminate the filibuster, but basically eliminate the filibuster so they can save face?
Right before I came on, I was just looking at reports of Sinema saying that she was dead set against eliminating the filibuster and that she would not change her mind. The thing is, a lot of people are against it before they're for it.
Even Harry Reid.
That's literally what I was about to say.
And Barack Obama.
And Mitch McConnell. Mitch McConnell was in the reverse direction. Mitch McConnell was extremely pro-nuclear under President George W. Bush when Mitch McConnell was the number 2 ranking Senate leader and was leading the floor effort to go nuclear under President Bush. So being on both sides of this issue is a rite of passage. Take that for what it is. I think that there's also a lot of different ways to get at reform. What the filibuster is in many ways in the eye of the beholder, as we've been talking about here. What people think of is Jimmy Stewart talking on the floor. It's not that today. If reform led to some sort of restoration of the talking filibuster, people could say they saved it. The threshold condition is really, is it possible for a majority of senators in some reasonable amount of time to bring an end to debate? To restore what the Senate's supposed to be, you need to continue to allow people to have the opportunity to debate, to have a role in the process. But, what the framers wanted was a Senate where, when that debate had clearly become obstructionist, that it could be brought to an end. Not right away, not maybe even within a few days, maybe it's weeks, whatever. All that can be figured out. The point is there's many paths to reform. And the last thing I would say is that circumstances are just going to force this issue to a head because Republicans are going to block Biden's agenda let's say we go through reconciliation and max out that process, you still have issues like civil rights and democracy reform that are absolute must-pass bills for Democrats during this 2-year period. You can't do those through reconciliation, and you're gonna face a hard backstop of saying, do we give up on this and basically give up on our democracy, or do we reform the filibuster? We may go through a period of wandering here before we get to this end result, but sometime, I think this year, this is going to come to a head. I think that ultimately, Biden, if he wants to be successful, is going to have to pursue some kind of reform.
Yeah, and in terms of whether it happens this year or not, I think what your book argues is also that this is a fundamentally anti-democratic tool, and at some point, Democrats will have to come down on the side of whether they support majority rule or not. And right now, they are upholding minority rule by doing nothing.
I think that argument is very compelling to a lot of senators, but there's enough folks in the caucus who are going to have to be sort of forced by events to really confront the stark prospect of failure or reform. And I think that's how this is ultimately going to come to a head.
So as someone who was inside of Harry Reid's war room, what advice do you have for progressive members of Congress, progressive organizers, progressive activists seeking to push Joe Biden and Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer to end the filibuster and pass policies that help the majority of Americans immediately?
So I think the focus really needs to be on delivering results. People are at least a little bit encouraged by how aggressive Biden has been, at least in what he's proposing to do. Then the question becomes, does he intend to slice all that stuff in half and go with half a loaf, or does he intend to follow through on the things that he promised to do? Forcing that conversation to happen on his own terms. And it's not acceptable to say we're not going to do these things in deference to this Jim Crow relic, to use President Obama's phrase. People are so tired of Republicans' bullshit, pressuring Biden, pressuring senators, and saying, you promised these results. We will not accept, as an answer for why you can't achieve them, we will not accept the idea that you're going to fail to achieve these results because you care so much about preserving this Jim Crow relic. Don't let the filibuster stand in the way.
From the perspective of like a Harry Reid staffer like yourself in 2009 and a Chuck Schumer staffer in 2021, what is most different about the progressive movement today? Like from the perspective of staffers of leadership, is it just that no one takes Republicans seriously and therefore progressives have an argument, or are there other things that have happened too?
Our caucus is smaller now than it was in 2009, but it's denser in a good way. The density of progressive views within the caucus is much higher today than it was in 2009. Even though we had 58, 60 votes, depending on the month in 2009, 2010, you had like 15 senators who were deeply conservative: Blanche Lincoln, Joe Lieberman, Ben Nelson. And now, you've basically got Manchin, Sinema, maybe Chris Coons a little bit. It's a much more densely populated caucus in terms of progressives. I think the same is true on the staffing level. I think that people are just done with the bullshit in a very important way. I think there's still relationships across the aisle, but too many people on the Hill have had similar experiences to what I describe in the book in the Manchin-Toomey background checks debate, trying to do the process the right way and seeing it blow up in their faces because of Republican obstruction. So I think the scales have fallen from a lot of people's eyes, and that's an important shift in the dynamic versus 10 or 12 years ago.
Adam, thank you so much for joining us on the Bloc Party.
It was great to be here. Thank you so much.
Thank you again to Adam Jentleson, author of Kill Switch: The Rise of the Modern Senate and the Crippling of American Democracy.
Since we recorded with Adam, the calendar has turned to February 2021, and it looks like Democrats are moving forward with using budget reconciliation to pass Biden's $1.9 trillion COVID relief bill. This brief moment of Congress actually doing something and voting on amendments will provide a brief distraction from the specter of the filibuster, but budget reconciliation can only be used once per fiscal year, so Democrats could do budget reconciliation again this fall after the 2021 fiscal year ends in September, and then that would technically be budget reconciliation for fiscal year 2022. But before we forget, we did get our first taste of the war to come on the filibuster in the final week of January. McConnell was refusing to allow the Senate to convene at all unless Schumer committed to not nuking the filibuster. Schumer didn't concede, but Senator Joe Manchin and Senator Kyrsten Sinema publicly stated their opposition to ending the filibuster, and that was enough for McConnell to declare victory. But Schumer still has the threat of nuking the filibuster, didn't concede. So, Waleed, what do you think? Who won this first skirmish?
My guy, Chucky Schumer, coming in with the win. We defeated Mitch McConnell because Chuck Schumer is standing up for the basic tenets of democracy, which is that the majority of voters should have a say in the government that they elect. But it's really high stakes because the Senate is split 50-50 with Vice President Harris coming in as a tiebreaker for Democrats. And so when Mitch McConnell was doing this, he was trying to ensure that he could pre-negotiate the rules so that he could take the leverage that Democrats have from potentially invoking the elimination of the filibuster in the future off the table. And so Schumer basically telling McConnell to fuck off is helpful because even if Democrats don't go forward with eliminating the filibuster, at least it's still in their back pocket as a card that they could wield down the line.
Right, and McConnell was not even letting the Senate pass the, quote, organizing resolution that lays out the rules for this coming legislative session. McConnell was not letting that move forward until he got this commitment in a, quote, power-sharing agreement with Schumer. What happened, though, was that Senator Joe Manchin and Senator Kyrsten Sinema just said stuff to the media that McConnell then claimed as a win. See, you're saying Chucky Schumer won, but Mitch McConnell sent out a press release because Joe Manchin went on the record and said, quote, "I do not support doing away with the filibuster under any condition. It's not who I am." Wow, this accidental rule, accidentally created by Aaron Burr, it's become part of who Senator Joe Manchin is.
It's like saying you don't have a racist bone in your body. I'm like, what is that?
What does it mean?
It's not that deep, man. It's not that deep.
Where did the bones come into this conversation? Anyways, and then Sinema said on the record she is, quote, against eliminating the filibuster and she is not open to changing her mind about eliminating the filibuster.
Right.
I mean, there are even some people in the Democratic Party who would not agree with you that Schumer won, right? Because he has to get every Democrat, all 50, because the margins are so slim, to agree to end the filibuster, right, and have Kamala Harris come in and be a tie-breaking vote if necessary. And if he doesn't have Manchin and Sinema, he can't do that.
I mean, the real issue is whether Leader Schumer, who I swear all allegiance to as a Democrat,
Majority Leader from New York.
Senator Schumer is going to figure out whether his words are going to match his action. He is going on Rachel Maddow saying he's not that keen about working with Republicans just for the sake of working with Republicans.
But isn't the lesson there that it's not worth trying to get bipartisan legislation because it will weaken it and make it worse, and they're never going to vote for it anyway?
Our North Star has to be the legislation itself. It has to be big and bold and strong. If Republicans work with us to get good, strong legislation, yes. But I agree with you. I've made these arguments in numerous places. Look at 2008, where we spent a year and a half trying to get something good done, ACA, Obamacare, and we didn't do all the other things that had to be done. We will not repeat that mistake. We will not repeat that mistake.
That's a step forward, but the real question is whether Schumer is going to unite his caucus around that view and push Senator Manchin and Senator Sinema to actually be united. Joe Biden is all about unity. Chuck Schumer, let's get on board. Let's unite the Democratic caucus for the sake of unity.
Waleed, I'm proud of you. I see you've already been out there organizing. Just as Democrats tweeted out all 50 Democratic senators and was like, here's your senator's position on the filibuster. And I'm like, Waleed, he's already 2 days after the Jentleson interview. He's organizing.
There's a lot of Democrats who are not named Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin who have not come out in favor of the elimination of the filibuster. So it's important to remember that there are several other Democrats who we need to pressure who aren't the hardest to get.
It's scary to speak aloud how high the stakes of this fight actually feel or actually are for American democracy. Unless you're Eric Levitz and you just write the scariest pieces in a New York Magazine. His piece from January 27th, "The Democrats' Civil War Over the Filibuster Has Barely Begun," lays out just how bleak the political prospects for Democrats are in the next decade, taking back the Senate and the House after this period of slim, unified control of Congress. I don't know, Waleed, are we scared to say aloud that the next 6 months are maybe the most important 6 months in the next decade for the Democratic Party, for American democracy? I don't know. I don't want to raise the stakes too much.
You know, I tweeted that if Democrats don't eliminate the filibuster and deliver real results for Americans, that Democrats could forego having unified control of the federal government for another decade. And then avid Bloc Party listeners, Ezra Levin, founder of Indivisible, and Zephyr Teachout, an expert on corporate concentration of power, tweeted back being like, just a decade? And I was like, okay. I was trying to be optimistic, folks, but a generation seems more like it. Getting outflanked here by the Indivisible moms. But no, seriously, Republicans, here's a good example. Republicans are in control of how 188 seats in the House of Representatives will be districted in the redistricting process. Democrats are only in control of 47 seats in the redistricting process.
This is after the census results come out this spring. There's going to be redistricting of all the House districts that everyone has been competing to win this past decade that we all know are massively gerrymandered from 2010. And we've talked about how the 2010...
Yes, this is a gerrymander on top of the 2010 gerrymander.
Okay, all right. Very good. Unless
Democrats pass H.R. 1, which would... My understanding of H.R. 1 is that it would eliminate the ability of parties controlling state legislatures to have partisan gerrymandering where Republicans can just rewrite the districts themselves and Democrats can also rewrite the districts themselves.
Right, so like in Wisconsin where Republicans have gerrymandered the state legislature and now then they use the state legislature to draw the congressional maps and it's one gerrymander gets you another gerrymander, H.R. 1 would take that power away from that state legislature and make it a nonpartisan commission. Is that right?
Yes, and the only way you can enact that is by having a simple majority vote because there are not 10 Republicans who are going to support that. And so it really puts into clear sight how important eliminating the filibuster is to the Democrats' ability to win the 2022 midterm elections and then continue having unified control of the government.
And that's just the structural disadvantage of the House of Representatives. We're not even talking about the Senate.
We're not even talking about the Senate. We're not talking about voting rights. We're not talking about the John Lewis Voting Rights Act.
Which is just to say it's going to be hard to win all these things. And no one is expecting 10 senators from the Republican Party, the same Republican Party in which 100+ House of Representatives were like, yep, election fraud, absolutely. A coup? We just had a fascist insurrection that failed, and a failed coup attempt 3 weeks ago.
The question is, are Democrats going to be able to continue punting on their priorities? And I don't think they're going to be able to continue punting on it because all of these things they're proposing, whether it's on climate legislation, immigration, democracy reform, ending gerrymandering, voting rights, all of these things run up against the filibuster. The gun reform bill that we talked about in Adam's interview, you're not going to be able to pass any of those things without eliminating the filibuster. And so maybe they're punting on it for now, but eventually this question is going to be raised again whenever they want to move any of these things forward.
Waleed, thank you so much for taking the hosting mic. Hope you had a good time with Adam. And
please subscribe and rate our podcast based on my interview alone with Adam. If you post that you like me hosting, I will be given the opportunity to host again. If you don't, this is probably the last time I'll be hosting. So.
It's a real tight ship. It's a high stakes audition. We
never ask people to subscribe and rate. I hear all the other people as the clients like, please rate and subscribe.
It's true. You know, the vibes are very, very chill at Bloc Parties. You know, thank you, Waleed. Thanks for listening. If you want to let us know what you think about the pod, you can email us at blockpartypod@gmail.com. If you review us 5 stars on iTunes, you know, that's so kind of you, but I understand it's a hard time. So, anyways, thank you again to our producer, Becca Rose, to our mix engineer, Leslie Gaston Bird. Special thanks, as always, to Amy Westervelt and Michael Catano. Waleed, see you next time.
Okay, bye.
See you on the block.